In our very first episode of Mind Unlocked, we are honored to have Dr. Joe Greener join us. Joe works on computational methods at the Medical Research Council Lab of Molecular Biology, also known as LMB. LMB, situated here in Cambridge, is one of the world's leading research institutes, dedicated to advancing understanding of biological processes at the molecular level. Joe works on improving molecular dynamics methods and has contributed to various scientific software packages. Most notably, Joe is developing MOLY, a pure Julia software package for molecular dynamics, which simulates the movement and interaction of molecules. Previously, Joe was a postdoc in the bioinformatics group at University College London and a PhD student at Imperial College London. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, and it's a real honour to be the first guest on your podcast.
Yeah, we're very, very grateful for that. So you are currently a group leader at LMB, working on molecular biology. So can you tell us about your motivation for working in this field? And what do you enjoy the most about it?
Yeah, I see molecular biology as really complex and fascinating. Basically, it covers kind of all aspects of life at the molecular level. I'm a computational chemist, really. I develop methods to improve the simulation of biomolecules. And so I'm pretty much the only one at the LMB doing methods development in that area. But I see it as really fundamental way to study these processes. There is a distinction between experimental science and computational science. In an experiment, you ask a question of the universe and it basically tells you the answer, and there may be a lot of noise, but it's the answer, and so you must trust it. With a computer, the computer does, it does whatever you tell it to do. It has no preconception, no ideas of what it should be doing, and so it's a kind of different sort of challenge. You have to model the whole system. Obviously, you have to make approximations, and I think it was Feynman who said, what I cannot create, I do not understand. So. As computational chemists, we try and create a model of the world, and in order to try and understand the world. Of course, there are many biomedical applications as well of what we do here, but for me, I consider myself a basic scientist, which means I'm doing things for the sake of understanding itself, and later on that will be hopefully useful. Mm-hmm. What do I enjoy most? Was that part of the question as well? So biology, as I said, is really complex. You have these huge molecules, lots of noise. You have a system which is there because of evolution. We think it's evolved to be that way, and yet when it in your body, it's just atoms floating around. Your body doesn't kind of know its evolutionary history, and some people that complexity would be challenging. It kind of hampers your ability to study the system, perhaps. But I kind of really like that. You have to dive into the details, and I'm pretty sure there's nobody in the world who knows all the details of every aspect of molecular biology and computational chemistry. So I think that's it's quite exciting.
Mm. And actually, I do want to ask a follow up.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So if the computational result is different to the experiment, how will they manage?
Yeah, this is the real challenge of computational work, and the answer is that the experimental result is always right in the sense that it's a real observation of the universe. Of course, there can be sources of noise, or you could have interpreted the experiment wrong, so it may be right in a way that you didn't understand. But whenever there is discrepancy, you must try and improve the model, or at least try and quantify the discrepancy. And that's one of the major drivers of what I do, which is improving force fields. So a force field is a kind of mathematical series of functions that describes how a molecule moves. And we use approximations because quantum mechanics is very expensive. And so you can measure how the molecule moves, and does that compare to what we know to be true from experiments? And there are differences. So then you have to ask, is this because the model is fundamentally limited? Is it because the parameters we've chosen? Or are we just not running our models for long enough? And so that's the real challenge of computational chemistry.
And so you are currently a group leader here, and you have many years of experience as a researcher. So what kind of path has led to your current position, and then what moment or decision really shaped the direction of your career?
Yeah, it's been subject-wise, it's been a little bit of a winding path. Geographically, not so much, because I was an undergrad here in Cambridge University doing natural sciences, and then I was a PhD student at Imperial College London doing bioinformatics, and then I was doing kind of structural bioinformatics at UCL when the recent exciting advances in protein structure prediction came in. So that was amazing, and I kind of learnt machine learning there. And then I kind of returned back a bit towards computational chemistry. So in terms of paths, I mean, I remember when I was kind of a child, and, as a child, you obviously want to do all sorts of things. I wanted to be a football player. I wanted to be a super spy. I wanted to be a train driver. I wanted to be an astronaut, a different thing every week. And then when I was probably about 13 or so, me and my friends were getting into video games, and I was getting into programming a little bit, making these small kind of animated games. And
your own video games.
Yeah, not good ones or terrible ones. Some people in my year were much better than me, but what it got me into was modeling physics, basically. And at that point, if you asked me, I would have said I wanted to design video games, but really what I wanted to do was model the world, as it were. And so as I got into science at A level, and chose that and learnt more about that, I realised that I wanted to make models of the natural world. And I started as a biologist. A lot of the smart kids in my year went to do medicine, and they were kind of very surprised that me and another friend went to do biological sciences, because they kind of saw that as less suitable or less interesting. But I knew at that point I wanted to do research rather than medicine. And then when I got to Cambridge, the wonderful thing about a degree is that it's you can basically choose all the modules you want. So I ended up just choosing chemistry modules and ended up as a chemist, really, with a project that was computational, and that was kind of that was the birth of that. I think in terms of, you mentioned big decisions, I've always focused on learning maths. I wouldn't say I'm a good mathematician, but for what I do, I'm decent enough. And probably the big decision was to just continue doing the hard maths modules. I remember in second year at university, the maths for physics course was very challenging for me, because I hadn't done any physics. I hadn't even done physics A level, and all the examples were physics based. And I persevered. I got an okay mark in that, and I use that maths now almost every day. So I think having the belief that you should learn the things you want to learn rather than the things that are easy, rather than just taking the easy choice, I think that's a big decision.
So which one particular maths topic do you use the most now?
Linear algebra. And I'm amazed that school maths, A-level maths, really doesn't prioritise linear algebra, matrix methods, anything like that. They are in the syllabus, but as far as I know, they're more consigned to kind of secondary modules, whereas the main modules are kind of more about calculus and trigonometry. But maybe this is just my bias, but I haven't used any of the complex trigonometry I learned. But I use linear algebra almost every day.
So it's like differential equation and matrix.
Yeah, matrix. I mean, for instance, neural networks and machine learning methods use all sorts of matrix products and vector matrix multipliers and all these things, even up to the ChatGPT type models, which transformers. These are all just matrix operations. It's all just linear algebra. And that maybe could be prioritized more in the maths curriculum, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So you've talked about your journey. So I'm wondering, what mindset shift have you found that helped you the most over the years?
I think as a student, people are very focused on getting the answer right. And there's a few reasons for that, but the main reason actually is that as a student you're ranked in your peer group, and so you're supposed to come top. You're supposed to be the best. Mm-hmm. And the exams are supposed to rank you. There's always a right answer, and you're supposed to get it. And then suddenly you get into research, and in research there's no right answer, or we may not know that there's no right answer. And that can be quite demoralizing because you don't get an exam result, you don't have a deadline, no one tells you you're right. It may take years or decades for the field to work things out, and so being comfortable with that ignorance, really being able to sit with it for a long time and say I don't know what's going on. In terms of a mindset shift, I think you have to, as a student, you're trying to be the best in the room because you want to become top of your class. But as a researcher, you really want to be the worst in the room. You really want to find the rooms where people are smarter. You want to find the conference where everyone knows something that you don't, because that's where you improve. So I think it's about being humble in your knowledge and trying to go beyond kind of thinking about 70, 80, 90% and trying to really just ask the right questions and be aware that it may take potentially years or decades to answer them.
So it's like the learning mindset.
Exactly.
From others.
Constant learning mindset. I try and read textbooks regularly. These are textbooks I read when I was 19, but it's like a good book in literature. You get something new out of a great book every time you read it. And so I recently finished reading. I say reading. I was skimming the Riley Hobson Bent's math textbook from which is commonly used by undergrads that I used in my first year of uni. And
yeah, sure you haven't read it.
Yeah, I mean, I say read. It's got many thousand. It's got hundreds of pages, but I kind of skimmed through it, and I got something much different out of it than I did reading it the first time. Yeah, because I could see where these techniques are being applied.
That's true.
Yeah.
And so you've mentioned the maths you've learned in undergrad has really helped you, and then the constant learning. So what other skills, habits, or practices have you been very important in your journey, and how did you develop them?
I mean, programming will be the obvious one. Yeah, so programming I started for fun. I think most people start programming for fun, actually. And just learning that craft of, Python and then Julia, which I really enjoy. And then recently kind of GPU programming as well. Habits or practices, I think it's really important to have a balanced life, actually. So I've never done a kind of all-nighter. I kind of try and work a consistent time frame. It's a little bit shifted. I tend to get in late and leave late, but my times are fairly set. I don't do too much on the weekend. I kind of often think about ideas or do fun stuff, but it's not like I'm working through the weekend like a lot of scientists do. And that's important for, being in it for the long haul for decades. You have to avoid burnout. And then I guess there's also the personal side is that, science is done by humans, and you have to try and listen to what other people think and be empathetic and respectful. And I think, never criticizing people for their ignorance because people are, I'm ignorant in ways I don't even understand. So, should try and be kind to people. And, there's lots of examples of that in academia, but one would be, trying to avoid aggressive questions at the end of seminars, trying to think about where the speaker is coming from rather than trying to tear them down. And yeah, I think that's the best way to have a good scientific culture. Yeah.
And so what advice do you wish someone had given you when you were younger?
Yeah, I had a really good upbringing in terms of, in many ways, but in terms of educational, I was always given very good advice by my teachers and my peer group and my family, my parents. I went to a very good school, a very good state school, which, where I made friends that I still have today, and it was still very clever. So I'd say probably, do the hard things, to pick the hard modules. Don't just try and pick the module which is going to give you the easiest exam. Exactly, because you want to struggle through the hard stuff, and that's what will really make you good.
And then, so what about advice for people who are looking to apply for PhDs and start a career in research?
Yeah, I think so. If you're just kind of cold emailing people, and you can do that, so you really can just email academics, and they often will respond. Whether they respond or not is kind of unrelated to how, what they're doing or how senior they are. It's just whether you happen to get them in the right frame of mind, and maybe you'll get a response. So you can cold email people, but just be very aware that their time is very valuable, and so just outline very clearly what it is you want and who you are. I think if you're writing proposals, for instance, a research proposal, people often make that too complex. So you really want to highlight to a general audience why this, why me, why now, and make sure it's well written and understandable. Basically, I've seen a lot of CVs now as I'm starting to grow my group, and a lot of people do fail on quite basic things about just concise communication. Yeah.
Okay. So and also this proposal is part of the the cold emailing. The first email that was sent.
It could be. It depends a bit on the position. Yeah. So it depends. If it's a PhD position, then maybe there won't be a proposal, but a postdoc can maybe come with a proposal. That could be useful. They don't have to, but
okay.
And then if for group leaders, I'm less qualified to give advice there because I've only just become a group leader. But it's all about just the conciseness and clarity of vision. That's the most important thing.
Okay, so it's like an elevator pitch.
Exactly.
You make you kind of match the interest, match with the interest of the other person.
Exactly, because they'll be scanning. You might, if you do a cold email, you'll probably spend half an hour writing it or something, maybe even more. You spend a lot of time writing it. Yeah. They're going to spend 2 seconds reading it. They're going to spend 2 seconds. And so you have to make sure that in those 2 seconds, they get the information that you want them to get. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really important.
Okay. So it's firstly, don't be afraid to cold email professionals.
Yeah.
And then also be very concise.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, so how do you think about success? And how do you define a good life?
Yeah, I'm not going to go and say that money's not important, because I've always been very lucky to be financially stable. I kind of grew up in a stable environment. So you need to find a job that can make you financially stable, whatever your definition of that is. But the truth is, for a talented person coming out of a good university with a good set of skills, is that there are a vast number of jobs that will make you financially stable. And so the question is then, which one should you pick? And I think there should be, the one criteria you cannot do without is that it's something that excites you. Mm-hmm. Because I think, there's probably, is it 80,000 hours or something, the number of hours in a career? You don't want to be doing something that you don't care about, mm-hmm. for that amount of time. You'll have quite literally wasted your life. So you have to be passionate and care about it. And then ideally something that helps people. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that's necessarily a hard requirement for a kind of a good life, but you shouldn't be doing something that harms people. So you should think about what your criteria for that is. And maybe you think that something like financial services is damaging in many ways, and so you don't want to go into that field. But it's, it depends on the person. I think you can justify a lot of things, but you have to be consistent in what you think, basically. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think the idea of a kind of a passion, something you're excited to wake up and do, is important. There are a lot of talented people who just have jobs they hate and live for the weekend, and they seem happy with that. But that, for me, is not it's not the case. Yeah. So
you've seen people around you, maybe your friends, mm-hmm. what they've been like.
Thinking back to my university, I had a lot of very good physicists actually in my year. I was a chemist, but I had a lot of very good physicists, and most of them went on to do PhDs. Yeah. And they were all better than me, to be honest. And of the ones that have gone on to do PhDs, I think 3 or 4 have gone into either finance or data analyst jobs, which are unrelated to science but use the skills. Yeah. And then maybe 1 or 2 have gone to industry. So they're still doing science, but in a private setting, which has, its advantages as well, pros and cons. And I think maybe just 1 is still in research. So it is an aspect of who's left as well as who's the best, I think.
Mm-hmm. So do you know how much they enjoy their lives?
Yeah. This is a good question.
It's time to catch up with them.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe I should ask them that question, because I'm sure they'll have different inputs, different. Yes, look, as I said, some people are from very different backgrounds and have less financial security from their family, and so they they want to prioritize that for their family, and that's their choice. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the fact, like what you said about finding your passion. Yeah. And also, people are very different. Even the same work, some people find it very meaningful and others find it meaningless.
Exactly.
It's like finding your niche.
Yeah, yeah.
So now moving on to open source software, which is something you've worked on. So you've contributed to quite a lot of software packages. And how do you choose which projects to work on? Or like you also started the Molly software. So how do you choose to start that?
Yeah, I think almost all open source contributions come with someone wanting to solve the problem themselves, to do something themselves. So they're trying to do a task and there's no existing tool for that. So either they add a feature to an existing open source program. Very common is to fix a bug in an existing open source program, and that's kind of your gateway drug, and before you know it, you're contributing. And that's always been the case for me. In my PhD, I was contributing to bits BioPython because I was using it.
Yeah.
Then I was getting into Julia, and I wrote this biostructures package for dealing with structural biology tasks there because it didn't exist. So I needed it basically, and I still use that very regularly. And then with Molly, I was wanting to improve my Julia. I wanted to learn molecular dynamics, and the way I learn things is basically by coding them. I think, people often think, what's the difference between a theoretical scientist and a computational scientist? And for me, the theoretical scientists are clever enough to just look at the equations and understand it, basically. And I'm not one of those. I always get lost in the equations. But what I do understand is when I write it down in code and start to run it and start to model it, that's when I start to understand what's going on. And then you can change the system, you can see what happens. So I started Molly to understand molecular dynamics, and now we use it in my lab. And now we're kind of getting a bit into performance and how to make it fast. And that's a whole different kettle of fish, and it's very challenging. So I think we'll be working on that for many years to come, I think.
Mm. So how many years have you already worked on Molly? And how did this start as a funded project or more like a hobby that you do, in the evenings?
Yeah, it just started as a fun project, really, something I was doing on the side. It started, I think, in 2018 or 2019 when I was back at UCL, and just getting into Julia and trying things. And then when I moved here to the LMB, you obviously get a lot of freedom as an academic, which is one of the best things because you can work on the thing you're most passionate about. And so I was able to apply that tool full time, basically. And now I pretty much just code in Julia, and a little bit of Python.
Yeah. So it's Molly like the largest project you've worked on in terms of open source, and then it's
I think so. Yeah.
Of that.
Yeah. And what's the what? So
your vision.
Vision. Yeah. I mean, this is a good question because there's existing software, for instance, OpenMM and GROMACS, that have been around for decades and have wonderful people working on them, and they're really, really heavily optimized. And it's unlikely you'll be able to compete with them on speed, although we're trying to get a bit closer. And so I think the vision for Molly is to allow us to try really kind of new cutting edge machine learning techniques in simulations, for instance, differentiable simulation, which is something I've worked on, but also applying machine learning force fields, maybe enhanced sampling methods. Julia excels at tasks where you can where the user provides code, because Julia code itself is quite fast, as opposed to something like Python where the code is quite slow. And so I think I kind of see it as being a playground for research in molecular dynamics, and I think that will continue to be important for a long time.
Mm. Okay. And also, how do you measure the impact of the software programs you've written? Do you interact with users and you see their feedback? Yeah,
you do. I mean, usually the main interaction you get with users is them reporting bugs. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I often think there's open source software is in one of two states. Either no one's using it, and that accounts for 99% of software, or everyone's complaining about it, right? And that's like 1% of software. There's maybe 1 week in between where a few people start to use it and you don't get any bug reports. So basically it's good. Like getting bug reports is good, because it doesn't actually mean that your software is bad, which is what you might think it means. What it means is that people are using it, and that means it's at least useful. So often via issues. And what's great is when people they first contribute an issue, and then they contribute a small fix, and then they improve the documentation, and then they add a feature, and before you know it, they're slowly getting involved in the whole project, and that's really nice to see.
So is it like biologists who use your program?
Not really, no. It's it's more kind of computational chemists, a few material scientists, actually, people who I don't really know about the science they're doing, but they find it useful. So obviously citations as well, but citations for software I've always found have been harder to get. You know, my software is, amongst my papers, has not been well cited, but I consider it to have some impact. So it's kind of what you hear about people using, and yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, what do you think a healthy open source community should look like? What should the culture be?
Yeah, I think there is, the thing that everyone now realizes is bad is this idea of open source entitlement. So this is the idea that someone says, I want feature A, give me feature A. To which the response is, I'm doing this for free. I don't have to give you anything. And most people now realize this is wrong. So that's something to avoid, basically, is kind of just demanding things of open source maintainers. A system that can avoid burnout, I think, on maintainers is important. Lots of users is good, and contributors, and healthy kind of discussions. And I think one other thing I've noticed is people sometimes say, oh, this software is interesting, but in order for it to be serious software, it needs to have feature B. And usually what that person's saying is just, I'm interested in feature B, and I don't see why you would not include feature B. But the truth is, everyone has slightly different use cases, and you can have perfectly good software that doesn't introduce that feature. So I think just being
more understandable.
Yeah, more understanding of where the software comes from, and that sometimes great software doesn't have the feature you want, and that doesn't mean it's rubbish. But overall, I really enjoy being in the open source community. I'm involved in the Julia community quite a lot. The Julia community is fabulous. It's related to what I said earlier about trying to find the room where you're the least clever. That's definitely a room where I feel the least clever. So I try and chat to them as much as possible.
Yeah. So how do you chat them online, or do you have gatherings that you?
Mainly online, mainly online. But in-person gatherings are good. We used to have Julia meetings in London. I've been to a few Julia conferences, and so the internet's great for this, because it's asynchronous. It's there all the time. You can find random people. There might be 2 or 3 people in the world who care about what you care about, but the internet means that you can find them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what skills, like it can be technical or non-technical, that you think is valuable, like if you want to be involved in the open source community?
Patience.
Patience.
Well, on both sides, that's patience with when you're asking for something. People are very busy, and so they may take a while to respond. The other side as well is when someone might be genuinely stuck and trying to get help, and they're not providing the right information, or they're doing something silly, and just being patient with them, because they're not trying to waste your time. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. So I think patience goes a long way. The other thing is you do need people, either one person or a group who has a vision for a piece of software, who says, this is what this software is doing. It's not going to do something we're not interested in, and it's going to focus on that. And I think having that big picture and trying to go beyond just pull request after pull request really helps software develop.
Okay. So it's like having a clear list of features that.
Yeah. And often it's around the API, so the way the user interacts with it. So some of the best software I know just has a really clear, concise way of interacting with it. And so as a user, you feel you trust it. And that's just a sign of good vision as much as good coding.
Okay. And one last question.
Of course.
Is what do you think, what are the advantages and challenges of open source? Actually, we've discussed quite a lot of this. So is there anything else?
Yeah, I think there is a challenge. So for instance, in machine learning, a lot of the big software packages are backed by companies, basically. So, JAX is basically a Google product, and PyTorch is basically a Facebook product, or whatever. And open source struggled to provide packages on that scale, because you just can't have enough engineers working on it full time, because there's no money. So making that jump to kind of really widely used professional software is tricky in the open source community. And I think that's harmed Julia a little bit. Julia, for instance, doesn't have a a real machine learning framework that's as mature as something like PyTorch, because it doesn't have this big backing that you need in order to do that. So that's a challenge. Another challenge would be, I guess it's called bust factor. So how many people need to leave the project before it basically becomes abandoned? And often in open source, that's quite low. So you could have, for instance, a grad student who's brilliant, is around for 4 or 5 years, leads a project, and then disappears to industry. And suddenly you have this wonderful software that's not maintained. So that's a real challenge as well.
Yeah, okay. So are there a lot of like open source softwares that are, kind of dead?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. The number of dormant open source projects vastly outweighs the number of active ones. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a shame.
It is a shame, yeah. In science as well, because you often do some work for a paper and it turns into a package or some code. And that's archived, so that's kind of the bare minimum, that's great. But then in 5 years, maybe no one can install it. So it's a bit of a shame, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I've felt this like in my previous internships as well. Like I start a project but I probably don't have enough time to finish it.
Exactly.
And then it's hard to like pass it on to someone else to finish it. So it just
sits there till the end of time. Yeah.
Yeah. And okay, so thank you, and it's been a real pleasure to hear about your stories and experience.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have. Yeah, it's been very good, and I wish you all the best with the future guests.
Our listeners can find out more about Joe's work and talks by searching Joe Greener on Google. Joe is currently growing his group, so definitely get in touch with Joe if you're interested in a position in his group.